Yep.
Yes,
Yep.
right.
Yes.
All right. So I'll go again. Uh, Welcome everyone to Lecture 2, Season 2 of Citing Vulnerability. In this second season, as some of you know who attended the earlier lecture, we've got lined up as talks, people speaking on waste, biodiversity, aging, and care. As always, a wide variety and multiple dimensions of um, vulnerability being examined by people from different disciplines. So we have today Amelia DeFalco, whose work on aging several of us are, shall we say, very familiar with. Uh, so it's great to have you here, Amelia. And of course, people coming up later will speak on biodiversity. The chief of the Natural Sciences Unit in UNESCO Delhi will speak on biodiversity. Harry Korvalek, the sociologist, will speak on waste. So welcome all of you, and we look forward to Emilia's talk. Over to Atul for a formal introduction. Welcome all, and particularly you, Emilia. Uh, it should be mentioned that we are writing in very exciting times. Emilia has just released her new book uh, on post-human care and fiction, which I have thoroughly enjoyed reading. So it is, if you might want to say that, Emilia, a little bit of a celebration as well of your new book. Thank you for coming, and over to you, Atul.
Yeah, thank you, sir, and welcome once again, Professor DeFalco. And if I may formally introduce you to the audience, Amelia DeFalco is a professor of contemporary literature at the University of Leeds. She is the author of Uncanny Subjects, Aging in Contemporary Narrative, 2010, Imagining Care, Responsibility, Dependency, and Canadian Literature, 2016, and the co-editor of Ethics and Affects in the Fiction of Alice Munro. Her current research concerns posthuman approaches to care, vulnerability, materiality, and touch, and her talk today is titled Imagining Mycorrhizal Aging and Care. Over to you, Professor DeFalco.
Thank you. I'm going to just see if I can get this working. I can't see anyone anymore. Can you just let me know if you can see everything okay? Oh, I've got on the last slide. Can you see?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can see your slides.
And you just have the slides. You don't have any additional material.
No, we don't.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, Natal. And thanks also to Professor Nayar for inviting me to participate in this lecture series, which is, exactly what I'm interested in. It's exciting. I've looked at some of the previous talks in the previous series, and I feel very lucky to be in such company. So today I'd like to share some thoughts on care and aging beyond the human, as my title suggests. And for some time now, I've been exploring the concept of post-human care, as Professor Nayar mentioned, as a way of thinking about relations and dependencies that fall outside of conventional humanist care models. And as my title suggests, today's talk focuses on a particular kind of more than human relationality, by considering how fungal networks might contribute to efforts to reimagine aging, vulnerability, and care. So I'm going to be exploring mycorrhizal frameworks for imagining post-human aging, vulnerability, and care inspired by fungal fiction. So the term mycorrhiza, formed from the Greek words for fungus and root, refers to the symbiotic association between plant roots and fungal mycelia, in which the two organisms are conjoined in a mutually beneficial arrangement, exchanging nutrients and chemical messages, resulting in a complex, far-reaching network that is sometimes referred to as the Wood Wide Web. So I'll begin by providing a short overview of mycorrhizal relations and posthuman care, explaining how and why the heterogeneous concept of the posthuman can enrich the study of aging and care. And from here, I'll explore how shifting interpretations of fungi make them especially potent models for imagining more than human, or as I term it, post-human care. And the third part of my talk explores an example of post-human aging and care, as imagined by novelist Hiromi Goto in her 1994 novel, Chorus of Mushrooms. So Goto is a Japanese-Canadian writer whose work has been celebrated for its exploration of embodiment and difference across a range of genres, including, most recently, a 2021 graphic novel about a 76-year-old woman who flees a care home. This one's called Shadow Life. You can see it there on the right. So Goto's first novel, though, on the left, Chorus of Mushrooms, tells a fantastical story about aging and care on an Alberta mushroom farm. And it's an especially generative text for exploring the possibilities of mycorrhizal relations. Its blend of realism and fantasy encourages readers to imagine post-human forms of aging and care in its depiction of bodies and relations that unsettle humanist expectations. In Chorus of Mushrooms, Goto represents humans as entangled and one of many, depicting her characters as both material entities and narrative subjects enmeshed in vivid, vital worlds teeming with more than human life, fungal, animal, and seasonal. Unlike the majority of fungoid fiction, which highlights the uncanny, even horrific otherness of fungi, Goto's novel stresses continuity across more than human worlds. Building on Goto's imaginings of sustaining mycorrhizal relations, I argue that fungi invoke the material and metaphorical entanglements that inspire post-human approaches to vulnerability and care. So posthumanism is an expedient, if sometimes imperfect, shorthand for a wide range of critical positions devoted to interrogating, decentering, and even disrupting the human as a stable universal category, as many of you, I'm sure, quite familiar with this. Care theory, much like age studies, tends to be preoccupied with the human, and post-human care expresses an effort to expand this focus to include the wide range of non-human human interdependencies and ontologies that produce and sustain life, from the soil's macro and mesofauna and fungi that transform plant and animal remains into fertile soil, to the complex entanglements of the microbiome, to human-animal technological bonds. Posthumanism can help expand care philosophy's focus on humans as embedded in and embodied subjects, to consider the complex, more than human networks that embrace and bind subjects, not only to their species, but to the dynamic ecologies that envelop and connect all matter. And I use posthuman care then to describe a wide range of affects, energies, behaviors, attachments, and dependencies, both visible and invisible, that produce and sustain life in more than human worlds. So it is transcorporeal, transdisciplinary, a conceptualization of frequently overlooked, denigrated, minimized, even pathologized contact zones that are in fact ubiquitous and ongoing, sustaining, formative, and transformative. So as a result, posthuman care is not a future phenomenon. It not only describes new and emerging human technological entanglements operating across the life course, but also a wide range of long-standing, more than human relations that create and sustain embodied existence, relations that are always happening to, with, and around us, most often in quiet, unremarkable ways that are easy to overlook. Take the microscopic communities of the microbiome or the wood wide web, for example. So aging and care are unavoidably intertwined, and it's difficult to discuss aging without attending to care, since so many of the biases and stereotypes circulating around later life are based on popular associations between old age, dependency, and disability, and prejudice towards disability is a significant source of the prejudice towards older age. As Sally Chivers and others have demonstrated, cultural associations between later life, frailty, and impairment contribute to persistent, dangerous metaphors of population aging. You might have heard of the silver tsunami, for example, which is a common phrase used in North America. It's perhaps the most infamous example, but many of these metaphors treat aging adults as economic liabilities, as vulnerable bodies in need of expensive medical treatments and social care. And the age panic incited by such metaphors of natural disaster, as Chivers explains, this panic relies on the idea that people do not want to grow old if doing so involves physical or mental decline. And I would add, on the assumption that impairment and disability are necessarily synonymous with decline. So from this perspective, illness and impairment are the antithesis of so-called successful or productive aging, gerontological formulations that equate success with able-bodiedness, independence, and strength. This equation of success with ability, part of what Robert McClure terms compulsory able-bodiedness, this contributes to widespread antipathy toward aging and older adults. A fear of vulnerability and impairment makes the prospect of aging into what some sociologists term the fourth age, that is the final stage of life characterized by frailty and dependency. It can make that stage especially alarming, even panic-inducing to many. Posthuman aging, like posthuman care, involves destabilizing the normative human and undermining associations between the human, autonomy, independence, and able-bodiedness. It's important to note that these critical posthumanist approaches to aging, embodiment, and care are at odds with transhuman models, which are also confusingly so, also sometimes referred to as posthuman. So, as many of you know, transhumanists seek to eliminate and transcend aging as it is frequently experienced, as slowing down, as an accretion of impairments, as change, basically. They seek to eliminate and transcend aging, as change via biotechnology, biohacking, body modification, extreme diet, and exercise. So transhuman is distinctly ableist and gerontophobic in its prioritization of physical ability and strength, and efforts to mitigate or even eliminate human-animal vulnerability via technological intervention. And I know Professor Nair has written quite a bit on posthumanism in relation to these issues. So aging studies scholarship has expertly demonstrated the ubiquity of ageism in the global north and the degree to which populations are aged by culture, as is a common phrase from aging studies, especially in the UK, the United States, and Canada, where populations deemed old, senior, elderly, or aged are frequently interpreted as less than human by their younger counterparts. This kind of marginalization is inherent within humanism, which is constructed around a particular version of the human, able-bodied, white, male, young, heterosexual, so on. Posthumanism, unlike transhumanism, exposes the degree to which the human is and has always been an exclusive, unstable, sociopolitical, and economic concept masquerading as a biological category. So the iconography associated with posthumanism is very different from that associated with transhumanism, as you saw on the previous slide. So it's an imagery of transcorporeal relations, as opposed to species-specific transcendence, as you can see just in these examples of two book covers that you may be quite familiar with. As a theory and praxis devoted to not only decentering, but disrupting the human as a coherent, stable ontology, posthumanism can help aging and care studies to critique not only the socio-political disavowal of the humanity of aging subjects, but the very conceptual category of the human itself and how it has historically functioned as a tool of marginalization and exclusion. So though age studies, like care studies, has its roots in humanistic approaches that prioritize human individuals as the primary, often exclusive, focal point of inquiry, there is growing attention to posthuman alternatives that analyze aging organismically, that is, as an organismic phenomenon as opposed to a particularly human one, considering the meanings and effects of aging across a wide range of non and more than human entities. So as critical gerontologists Gavin Andrews and Cameron Duff explain, posthuman inflected gerontological work thinks of older humans as being of the world, as opposed to distinct from it. In this sense, the interconnected fields of aging studies and posthuman care embrace the embedded and entangled nature of being that is endemic to fungal networks. So part 2, consider the mushroom. In their 2005 essay, Dependency, Difference, and the Global Ethic of Long-Term Care, Eva Kate, Bruce Jennings, and Angela Wasuna introduced their demand for increased attention to global politics in care philosophy by contrasting human interdependence with the spontaneity of fungal life. People do not spring up from the soil like mushrooms, they write. People produce people. People need to be cared for and nurtured throughout their lives by other people, at some times more urgently and more completely than at other times. Their comments rehearse a key point from ethics of care, namely that myths of spontaneously produced, sovereign human beings problematically erase the formative care labor required for human existence, survival, and flourishing. As a counterpoint, they invoke the fungal kingdom, particularly its fruiting bodies, namely mushrooms. So mushrooms have historically functioned as a figure of quasi-magical, spontaneously sprouting life, serving as an image of independence and autonomy antithetical to human interdependence. So Kitty Jennings and Wasuna's opening remarks allude to Selah Benhabib's often cited essay, The Generalized and the Concrete Other, from her 1992 book, Situating the Self. And Benhabib's comments in turn allude to Thomas Hobbes' independent, self-sufficient mushroom men, as he terms them. So in his 17th century discussion of dominion and the rights of masters over slaves, Hobbes describes man in his so-called natural state, freshly, quote, emerged from the earth like mushrooms and grown up without any obligation to each other. Benhabib argues that, like many universalist and proceduralist philosophers, Hobbes conjures an image of man's independence that relies on an erasure of materiality, but also maternity and the larger collective production of human subjects, thereby freeing the male ego from the most natural and basic bonds of dependence. So Benhabib cites Hobbes's description of men, quote, sprung out of the earth and suddenly, like mushrooms, come to full maturity without all kinds of engagement to each other as the ultimate picture of autonomy. So from Hobbes's 1642 text through Benhabib's 1992 text, and then Kitty and Jennings and Wasuna's 2005 follow-up, the mushroom has often functioned in Anglo-European cultural and philosophical imaginary as an oppositional touchstone for the human, regarded as a mysterious organism, neither plant nor animal, a figure of spontaneous generation and pure independence. However, contemporary insights into the complexity and ubiquity of mycelia, that is the vegetative branching part of fungus that produces and supports its fruiting bodies through vast networks of hyphae. This research into mycelia has revealed Hobbes's mushroom metaphor as not only a mischaracterization of man's natural state, as care philosophers point out, but of fungi's as well. In fact, fungi are profoundly entangled organisms, as documented in a range of popular publications, including, perhaps most famously, Merlin Sheldrake's 2021 bestseller, Entangled Life, which details the complexity of mycelium networks and their enmeshment in plant and animal life. So these publications, you see some examples here, and many more, dedicated to communicating the operations of fungal life. And in fact, Alexis Harley in 2020 argued that publishing is in the thick, as she calls it, the thick of a veritable fungus craze. So this work dedicated to communicating the operations of fungal life has upended any notion of mushrooms as exemplars of independence and autonomy. Quite the opposite, argues Sheldrake. Fungal networks embody the most basic principle of ecology, that of the relationship between organisms. Mycelium is ecological connective tissue, a living seam by which much of life is stitched into relation. Mushrooms are only one manifestation of these complex, often microscopic mycelia, which form a connective tissue so remarkably communicative that, as I mentioned, it's often referred to as the wood wide web for its ability to facilitate connections across a wide range of species. So in short, mushrooms are not individual self-contained organisms, but one element, a reproductive organ, in fact, produced by multitudinous fungal colonies embedded in the soil. So as a result, interconnection, claims Peter McCoy, who's the co-founder of the radical mycology movement, interconnection is the primary lesson that fungi teach. Mushrooms and other fungi permeate the world, connecting and turning its innumerable cycles to demonstrate that every act carries an immeasurable chain of effects. The long-standing assumption that mushrooms spring up from the soil as discrete autonomous matter then is actually a distinctly anthropocentric misapprehension of non-human life that transforms dense entanglement into sovereign isolation. Philosophical appeals to mushrooms from Hobbes through to ethics of care obscure the complex, sustaining entanglements of flora, fauna, and fungi in their reliance on anthropocentric models of being that interpret human interdependence as species-specific, isolated from dense webs of interconnected existence. However, revelations of mycelial networks have made fungi potent evidence of the deep-seated entanglements that connect organisms across species and kingdoms. Fungi offer a model of being at odds with humanist individualism, a model in which organismic life is first and foremost relational, making them material and metaphorical emblems of post-human care. Fungi embody a relational ontology in their pointedly networked existence, at once conduits and organisms, entangled and separate. In the fungal world, relations produce organisms in a most material sense. So contemporary insights into the relationality of more than human being stress the human as entangled in, indebted to, encumbered, and produced by the non-human, including fungi. And Anna Singh's work, for example, traces assemblages of Matsutake mushrooms and their human collectors, companion species of a sort, in their interdependent precarity, which illustrates ways of being as emergent effects of encounters, as she puts it. Singh's anthropological investigation of human fungal entanglement is part of a series of turns toward more than human worlds that have been occurring in cultural theory over the past decades. The post-human turn, the object-oriented or ontological turn, the animal turn, the affective turn. All of these critical shifts involve an acknowledgement of human animals as embodied, interdependent, transcorporeal, affective beings, an acknowledgement of human relationality and vulnerability that contradicts neoliberal fantasies of independent, autonomous, rational humanist subjects unburdened by the vicissitudes of aging, illness, and frailty. Posthumanism, affect theory, and new materialism have functioned as vital correctives to anthropocentric models of selfhood that consign older, ill, disabled subjects, that is, those deemed unproductive, in, or non-human. It consigns those people to the margins, the dustbin, the institution. In their insistence on vulnerability, interdependence, and the porousness of the category human, these more than human turns inevitably draw attention to the necessity of care for human-animal being throughout the life course. The alignment of relational ontologies with mycological materiality continues the tradition of treating fungi as figures for socio-political imaginings. Just as mushrooms were recruited as representative of humanist individualism for philosophers, fungi have latterly become fruitful embodiments of the fundamental relationality central to a wide range of post-human philosophies. This takes us to the third part on Hiromi Goto's novel. So Hiromi Goto's novel was published 21 years before Singh's Mushroom at the End of the World, 26 years before Sheldrake's Entangled Life. Goto's novel imagines the mycorrhizal dimensions of human life, that is, the networked capacities of aging bodies as relational organisms. Goto explores amorphous, open-ended, interactive embodiments, interpreting human being as mycorrhizally relational in ways that anticipate this current fungus craze and its associated theoretical terms. Chorus of Mushrooms is a multi-generational polyphonic novel that explores the relationships amongst a family of Japanese-Canadian women living in the small town of Nanton, Alberta. The novel's title reflects Goto's approach to storytelling, which employs multiple narrative voices to produce a communal narrative, a chorus befitting the novel's fungi-centric perspective. In an interview with Robert McFarlane, Sheldrake has discussed polyphony as narrative and musical forms that echo mycelial networks in their ability to, quote, intertwine without ceasing to be many. Sheldrake, quote, came to think of fungal mycelium, which is both a multitude of growing tips and a single interconnected entity, as polyphony in bodily form. Goto's novel expresses this commingling in both its form and content, employing polyphonic narration to explore networked more than human embodiments. The novel's very complicated and difficult to encapsulate quickly, so I'll just focus on a few characters and episodes. Its primary characters include Muriel, who's also known as Murasaki, so this proliferation names is also part of this polyphony, and it's also difficult to summarize succinctly. So Muriel / Murasaki is telling her unnamed partner stories of growing up with her grandmother now and her parents on the family's mushroom farm. Nanton is a prairie town, hot and dry in the summer, cold and snowy in the winter. The warm, damp darkness of the mushroom barns is quite striking and at odds with the dry and dusty Alberta weather. And these barns function as the novel's warm, dank heart, spaces of mysterious, sometimes unsettling vitality, where characters discover unexpected post-human connections. So though the novel ostensibly opens with a fairly conventional narrative frame, Muriel, in bed with her partner, recalling stories from her childhood, especially her time with her grandmother, her Obasan, the boundaries between the narrative frame and the stories it contains are quickly blurred as a range of narrators, both first and third person, take over the telling. The novel's opening sentence, "We lie in bed, listen to the click of the blinds, watch a thin thread of dusty cobweb weave back and forth in the waves of air we cannot see." So this opening sentence immediately highlights the novel's collective narration and reliance on sensory storytelling, evident in the oscillating rhythms of departure and return conveyed by the lolling cobweb, as well as the significance of forces beyond human apprehension, the waves of air we cannot see. This attention to more than human bodies and forces continues throughout the novel, reflected in its structure, narration, and lyrical style. The novel's back and forth structure of repeated returns and temporal reversals thwarts linear expectations and denies teleological satisfaction. Timelines are jumbled, narrators come and go, characters converge and transform. In its disorienting temporal play, its focus on entanglement, its depiction of porous, unstable bodies, its attentive to more than human relations, Chorus of Mushrooms creates a mycorrhizal narrative that challenges teleological frameworks. As Muriel / Murasaki tells her partner when he complains that she, quote, switches around in time a lot, leaving him all mixed up, struggling to know in what order things really happened. She explains there isn't a timeline. It's not a linear equation. You start in the middle and unfold outward from there. It's not a flat surface that you walk back and forth on. It's like being inside a ball that isn't exactly a ball, but is really made up of thousands and thousands of small panels, and on each panel there is a mirror, but each mirror reflects something different. And from where you crouch, if you turn your head up or around or down or sideways, you can see something new, something old, or something you'd forgotten. So Goto's spherical mirrored narrative provides the reader with multi-dimensional views of its worlds, views that change according to the position of the viewers or readers, as the case may be. Muriel's explanation treats narrative as unfixed, its form and structure dependent on the perspective of the interlocutor. This complex temporal mode contrasts narrative aging approaches. You might have heard of narrative aging, which these approaches plot life cycles according to teleologies of growth, maturation, and decline. By emphasizing relations over individuals, Chorus of Mushrooms depicts aging as dynamic and unpredictable, with characters withering or flourishing according to the vibrancy of their networks. Now, for example, compares her isolated, insular youth when she refused opportunities for connection and the quote, her lips were, quote, an ornament upon her face. She compares this with her later life loquaciousness, stressing the power and fervor of her communication. Quote, now my face is crumpled with care and seams adorn my cheeks. My mouth bursts wide and the words rush out a torrent of noise and scatters. An old woman on a wooden chair might not be much to look at, but step inside her circle of sound and fall into a tornado. Now's self-described old age is a time of powerful, binding affects that evoke a vision post-human aging, a vision of post-human aging as a non-linear becoming that echoes Muriel's dynamic narrative model. This emphasis on the primacy of relations continues throughout Goto's novel, which pays close attention to embodied interactions, human and more than human, in all their sensuous detail. Goto relies on multisensory communication, especially smell and touch, to convey a range of more than human connections. As a child, Muriel is horrified to discover that her family's fungal entanglements register in intangible yet potent ways. For example, she learns from her best friend Patricia that her family home smells different than other houses, that it reeks of the, quote, clamor of mushrooms growing, and that the stench of the mushroom farm has infiltrated the walls of our home, the upholstery in our car, the very pores in our skin. We had been contaminated without ever knowing. For Muriel, who as a child seeks sameness and invisibility, this fungal entanglement is experienced as contamination, and her reaction to the fungal traces accords with Anglo-European mycophobia, evoking literary traditions of what Ben Woodard terms fungoid horror, a continuation of fungi's long-standing negative association with death, decay, filth, and parasitism. And you can see a few examples here. Perhaps the most prominent has been the really successful miniseries, The Last of Us, which came out recently. So as a result, Anthony Camara explains fungus joins the ranks of Anglo-European literary monstrosities in the late 19th century. Wildly variant fungal morphology erodes the religious notion of the teleological finality of divinely created life, and instead of radiating from on high as the eternal image and emanation of God, the fungus sprouts up from down low, emerging from excreta and decayed remains, only to return to them after the briefest season lived in darkness and filth. As both a product and agent of decay, the fungus is simultaneously of and for death. However, as I discussed in the earlier parts of today's talk, this association with death and decay is precisely part of fungi's generative liminality and queer potential as an emblem of unexpected, ungovernable agencies based firmly in relations. Chorus of Mushrooms narrates a fungal post-human turn as characters become increasingly attuned to the integrity of mycorrhizal relations, including, but not limited to, fungal entanglements. So Muriel gradually overcomes the sense of shame associated with her so-called fungal contamination. When she finally takes Patricia to see the barns, the buildings are steaming, quote, shrouded with mist that no amount of wind could whisk away. And Patricia describes the barns as enchanted castles. And once inside, the magic continues. I showed Patricia a room where the mushrooms were growing. In the silent hum of wet darkness, the mushrooms glowed like cavefish. Wow, she whispered, like in church. This moment of reverence marks a shift in Muriel's attitudes towards the farm, a growing appreciation of its wondrous, more than human life. So Muriel's Obasan now also narrates the novel, as mentioned earlier, her grandmother, telling fantastical stories about her childhood in Japan, her unhappy marriage spent as an occupier in China, her life in Nanton before and after Muriel's birth, her flight from Nanton during a snowstorm, and subsequent adventures as a freewheeling hitchhiker. Fed up with her desiccated life in Nanton, now flees the Tonkatsu family home where she has sat for 2 decades, as she mentioned earlier, in this hard wooden chair. She's never actually visited the family farm. Speaking Japanese largely to herself, since her daughter has willed herself to forget her first language in an attempt to embrace the whiteness synonymous with being Canadian in 1980s Alberta. So Now's departure is not particularly well timed, however. She leaves late at night during a howling snowstorm, and seeking refuge from the freezing prairie winds, she decides to explore the property's mushroom barns on her way out of town. Opening the barn door, she is immediately struck by the warmth and moisture of the space, the dank smells, which she experiences as mesmerizing beauty. Sensuous details abound in the long descriptions of Now exploring the mushroom barns during the blizzard. I'll just draw your attention to one in particular. So overcome by the earthy, damp heat, she removes all her clothes to bask in this rejuvenating fungal ecstasy. And there's a long description that I've included here. I won't read it now. But unlike her young granddaughter, Now she experiences fungal convergence not as contamination, but as sensual bliss. The passage is replete with animated language and vibrant, vital imagery, tingling, stirring, rippling. The space is characterized by moisture, softness, blood, damp, warmth, breath, murmuring, humming, swelling, bloating. The brittle desiccation of Now's body is revealed as less a function of aging than its segregation, its isolation from more than human relations that nurture and sustain it. The fungal breath, the fungal ecstasy, the fungal silence of the barns revitalizes her. Soothed and nourished, Now lies down in the peat water, quote, feeling the seeping, the sinking into. In Now's experience, fungal convergence is wondrous and invigorating, experienced as communion, not contamination. It's an experience of post-human care, generative, producing an ecstasy that sustains Now as she continues her journey away from Nanton. So, in conclusion, Chorus of Mushrooms offers a portrait of thinking and being mycorrhizatically. And in today's presentation, I've argued that this kind of fungal thinking can help illustrate and illuminate the degree to which care and aging in more than human worlds necessitates a post-human approach, alert to the formative role of relations. Posthumanism offers a critical vocabulary for investigating and communicating this entangled, embodied existence. And I argue that the theorization of care and aging can benefit from posthumanist approaches that engage the vicissitudes of embodied vulnerability in their modeling of relational being. Fungal posthumanism enables the interrogation and dismantling of the human as a discrete, autonomous individual and highlights the ubiquity and integrity of care across the life course. As Goto and other more contemporary fungal philosophers make clear, interdependence is a manifestation of our posthuman status. That is to say, our embodied, embedded, and relational condition as human animal beings enmeshed in dense, more than human, mycorrhizatic networks. As it stands, the majority of posthuman aging and care scholarship exists in the domains of sociology, anthropology, geography, and social work. Literary studies can help us enter into more than human worlds in imagined action, in this case, mycorrhizal ways of being and relating, divested of the stifling conditions of socio-political realities. Fiction like Goto's helps aging and care studies imagine otherwise, invoking novel ways of aging and relating that evade neoliberal scripts of compulsory able-bodied independence and youthfulness. With further investigation into the post-human theorizations offered by literature, we can begin to plot alternatives, perspectives, and ontologies alert the mycorrhizal dimensions of more than human entanglement. Thank you. And that's the cover of the book that Professor Nayar mentioned.
Thank you, Professor DeFalco, for that most interesting talk. Would you be taking questions from the audience? Questions, comments?
Of course.
Yeah, sure. So the floor is open to questions. You could click on the raise hand button. Yes, Labuni, please go ahead. Yes.
Hello, thank you so much for this lecture. I have a question. How would you distinguish between a mycelium-based relational network from a rhizomatic relational network?
I don't know that I would really distinguish them. I think they're quite similar because, I mean, mycelia follow a rhizomatic construction, right? Where there is no beginning and end. There's no, it's not a root and a flower, that they're one. I mean, the rhizome, I always find it helpful to remember what a rhizome refers to in a literal sense, right? In an ecological sense, as being a plant structure, which the root is also a stem. So I think in very much the same way, there is a kind of, well, it sounds like a negative view, but a kind of confusion, which in a very positive sense, a confusion between kind of beginnings and endings and centers and margins, which I think is integral to a lot of the work that is connected to post-human care, post-humanism, et cetera, is trying to disrupt these hierarchies or these assumptions about linearity. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you so much.
Well, it's nearly we're 10 minutes away from the end of time. Is that perhaps there aren't any more questions? Should we?
We could give it a couple of minutes and then if there are no more questions.
Sure. Thank you, Anna.
Yeah. Saurabh, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, ma'am, for that wonderful lecture. I had a different kind of a question. I was looking, I mean, you really detailed talk very nicely about the care paradigm with and established a relation of care, I think, between the human and the fungi, right? I mean, you got that explain the pattern really well. I was thinking when you were reading texts like these and when you were writing yourself, how much how to, because I was thinking of a more literary way where um, the the world of plants and fungi, but also in popular culture as have been portrayed as anti-human, for lack of a better word. I'm vaguely thinking of M. Night Shyamalan's films, or where the plants and and microbial organisms become the enemy of the human, and there's a space of reclaiming what was theirs once. I mean, I'm not I'm being a bit vague here because I can't remember all the sources well, but because I was also thinking about so this paradigm of post care and aging and it's interspersing with with the fungi. How, like, just thinking how when you were researching on this, like, do you do you think it's a move from that space of human to to being for the like human. I mean, because I was also thinking of a novel like the vegetarian, right? I mean, it's where the protagonist, she identifies as a as a vegetarian, as a tree at the end, basically. So I was thinking, and in your research, how do you think does have this transformation happened in post-human studies? I mean, it's very vague, I know, but I was just thinking, I like any thought about it.
Thank you. I have to admit I didn't catch all of your question. I'm not my connection isn't perfect, and so I'm getting a bit of echo. But so can I just clarify? Was the question about kind of how do I relate this work to um, anti-humanist traditions and whether and that because you
Ah,
see, is that fair?
yeah, kind of like so. Because you talked about care and aging, and where the post-human entity, as in where both the fungi and the human is working towards a common goal, and as you showed in the novel, that their lives are like where the protagonist is talking about their lives in these terms of the fungi. So I was thinking, contrary to this, in popular culture, where in films or novels, where often the not necessarily the fungi, but the world of nature has been often showed as anti-human. So
Yeah,
how do you see this change?
yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's I think there's a I don't know if I would go. I don't know the area. Like, I mean, I haven't been delving into the long history of fungoid fiction, so I can't say I can't say I have an exhaustive understanding of it. But I can certainly see your point that there is a long tradition of kind of like the fungoid horror that I mentioned, and this is maybe more common than the kind of generative vision that we see in the Goto, that where it's about competition and hierarchy, and it's The Last of Us is a perfect example where, I mean, even the phrasing of the title, right, is conjuring an us and them distinction. And I mean, there's something like the girl with all the gifts that I mentioned on that was on the slide that maybe starts to, and the beauty, those kind of start to kind of complicate that binary a little bit more. But the I guess a lot of those would be working according to very familiar humanist trends where they're relying on strong, well-established hierarchies, where the human is inarguably positioned at the apex, and then there's kind of great chain of being provides a very helpful model, and where plants are kind of far below um, the animals, and then fungi don't even really appear on that model, right? Because they weren't understood to be a separate kingdom at the time that it was established, and there's lots of great research into how fungi um, posed us a very unique and difficult problem for classification, because it didn't behave. It wasn't clear that it was something separate from plants or animals. It behaved a bit like plants, a bit like animals, and it actually was quite confounding. And that's part of the reason it was understood to be so kind of troubling and often something not quite right, and contributes to these trends of horror. I think. Uh, I think the idea that the idea that the Goto, certainly I would suggest, is like doesn't really fit with an anti-humanist model, in that it's because it's playing with continuity and relationality so powerfully in a way it's refusing that kind of pitting, that kind of competition model that would be. There's ways that anti-humanism can become kind of anthropocentric in another way, just in a different register. And I think it works against that kind of thinking. So I mean, in a very crude way, I guess you could kind of suggest there is a tradition, kind of a fungoid horror that relies on humanist tropes in a way that maybe some of these more these more recent fungoid literatures move towards the post-human, but I don't think it's often as clear-cut as that. I'm sorry, I'm not sure that really answered your question exactly about the anti-humanism.
That's okay. I mean, even I was just trying to form my points because it's just because in light of popular culture and this the history that I was trying to refer to, just
Mhm.
thinking, but yeah, that, thank you. So,
Ashasmiti, yes, please go ahead.
Hello, Professor DeFalco. I do not want to gush, but I'm a fan of your work. I have a question. Um, uh, Care talks, care works, and care ethics, especially along the lines that has been drawn by you and Mariah Belacasa. They talk about how care entails taking into account non-harmonious agencies.
Mm.
Um, and while I understand that, how would you explain caring for something that is detrimental to
Mm.
shared, independent, collaborative living?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a big one, isn't it? I mean, because like Maria does talk about that as well, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And there's a really wonderful essay by Myers and two others that I'm sorry I can't remember their names on technoscience and care, that where they go into it and like the closeness of care and harm and how we have to really avoid shying away from considering the degree to which they are so entangled and that they are not antithetical necessarily, and that there are often kind of that care always involves a turning away as much as a turning toward. You know, you can't care about everything. So I mean, this is the ongoing thorny thing, and I think the main thing is about the I would guess I would really agree with Maria here about a degree of awareness and vigilance that's required, you know, and that the point is to kind of be aware and to acknowledge that the limitations of care, and it's kind of a pursuing in spite of a kind of commitment in spite of its inadequacies, etc., partly because, you know, it's the limited options that are available. I think it's not there is not also, you know, she's very clear that there is not an obligation to care across the board, you know, that it remains selective, and that, you know, because it can tip over into martyrdom and a kind of reproducing very troubling patriarchal scripts of especially of gendered, racialized martyrdom. But at the same time, you know, I guess the emphasis is on um, relational, on the idea of sorry, just my mind went blank for just 1 second. But of responsibility, you know, this kind of feminist model of responsibility, and the as in the hyphenate version of responsibility as an obligation that comes out of responsibility, and that um, that it's not exhaustive and it's not all consuming though in every instance, and that there's still, I guess, the straightforward way of saying this is that there's always a politics of care. There's always a power dimension and a selection process, but that goes along with an acknowledgement of interrelationality, etc. But I take your point absolutely, and I think that's why thinking and writing about care requires this kind of ongoing vigilance and self-reflexivity and carefulness in the way we write about it, as not a kind of just, you know, open-ended obligation to everything and everyone.
Thank you, ma'am. I have another question. Do you have the time?
It's fine with me if it's okay with the organizers.
Atul?
Please go ahead, Ashasmiti. Yes, yes, yes. Please go ahead, Ashasmiti.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Professor DeFalco, Belakisa specifically points out that care, as you said, is not an obligation, but it is something to be enacted, practiced, and performed.
Mm-hmm.
But could there be ways of caring that are not intentional?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would think so. I mean, if we think about care ecologies, especially, right? It's about because the kind of people whose work who is especially inspiring to me is really pointing out, um, being as a result of relating. So, I mean, I read that as a result of a form of care. It's not necessarily a self-conscious donation, of goods and services. Care is that kind of experiential entanglement. And so I don't think, I think it happens all the time, and it's just that I think that care can be, it depends on how we define care, but care, it gets elevated in a way to a very specific kind of maybe almost martyr-like activity, that then I think potentially obscures the everydayness, the ubiquity, the smallness of care that's happening in these unconscious ways all the time. I like your picture, by the way. That's very nice to see you and your dog.
Yes.
If there are no more questions, if there are questions, you could click on the raise hand button, and but then if there are no more questions, we could move on to a formal vote of thanks by Professor Anna Kurian, who is the faculty fellow of the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies here at the University of Hyderabad.
I think we are done with questions. I can't see any more hands going up. Thank you so much, Professor DeFalco. It was illuminating, and especially because when I first read the title of your talk, I was clueless as to where this was going with fungus, because not really an area which I'm familiar with, and though very interested in the idea of care and aging, but fungus, it was like question mark, question mark. But you have made a lot of sense, not just for me, I'm sure, but for all those who are listening today to you. And we're very grateful that you gave us this talk. And we hope to read more of this in your work as it comes along. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the invitation today. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Amelia. We'll look forward to your next book.
Give me a moment.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
everyone. Yeah. All right.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.